All right, hey everybody, coming at you live from my house. I made a couple of slides here for clearest and muddiest points. So you should be able to see on the slide here some clearest points. Common ones, differentiating validity and reliability, types of validity, operationalizing variables, all that good stuff. All right, now here are all of the muddiest points. So as usual, I counted up how many people listed each muddy point across both of my sections of methods, and you can see them all here on the screen. I'm going to go through a couple of these, but first I want to talk about these two. So the most common muddiest point was actually people having trouble with the activities. And something further down, a couple people mentioned difficulties with adjusting to online learning, and somebody specifically mentioned having a hard time learning alone without talking to peers. So I'm going to send out an email to you guys pretty soon. I'm going to ask to gauge your interest in having some kind of a virtual optional drop-in session, maybe during our class time, so that people who are struggling with the module activities or people who are interested in being able to talk over ideas with their peers and with me would have a chance to do that. I'm thinking probably something like Thursdays so that people have the first couple days of the week to get started on things. And then that way you can, if you're noticing that you have questions about things, then you can come to the optional drop-in meeting and ask those questions with plenty of time before the module is officially due in order to get some help. So I'm going to send out an email asking for you guys' interest in that. If enough people are interested, then I will schedule that and do that. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Another thing I want to mention here is that a couple of people specifically mentioned having trouble reading this week's research article, but a couple people also specifically mentioned that they thought this article was the easiest of the three so far. So what I'm going to do is create a discussion board where people can drop by and talk with each other about how they approach reading research articles, and you can give your classmates tips on what you do that you find helpful. So if you found this research article pretty easy to understand, I highly recommend drop by that discussion board and write a little bit about what you do to read research articles, how you approach them, what makes them easier for you. And then if you're one of the people who found it a little harder this week, you can drop by that discussion board too and see what people are saying and ask questions. So I think that'll be a nice way to do that. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to send you guys more information about both of those things pretty soon here. All right, now the next most common muddiest point was this idea of operationalizing variables. I know it's been a while since we met in person, so it's easy to forget some of these things. And operationalization is tough to get the hang of anyway, no matter having an interruption and all this pandemic stuff going on. So operationalizing variables, well, basically what you're doing with operationalizing is you're taking a conceptual variable, so something that you want to study in your research project. So say you want to study intoxication, right? You have to decide exactly how are you going to measure or manipulate that. Because if you just say, hey, I'm going to study intoxication, nobody would be able to replicate what you're doing because they don't know, and you don't have a specific way to test that. Oh, you can see my cat behind me. So one variable could have a lot of different operationalizations. You as a researcher have to decide which one you think is best. So say you are trying to study intoxication, maybe you decide that you're going to measure that and you're going to measure it by testing people's blood alcohol content. So maybe you're going to classify when people have a blood alcohol content level over 0.08%, that you're going to say, okay, that counts as intoxicated, anything below that is not. That's one way you could do it. But you could do it other ways too. Maybe you're going to manipulate intoxication. So you give some people no beers, some people 2 beers, some people 4 beers. So they're getting different levels of alcohol, right? You could do that as a way to manipulate intoxication. The people who get the most beers should be the most intoxicated. You can compare what they're doing to the people who got fewer or no beers. You could also measure it differently. Maybe instead of blood alcohol content, maybe you decide to ask people to try to walk in a straight line. And if they can do that, you can classify them as not being very intoxicated. But if they can't do that, they're stumbling all over the place, maybe then you record that as being intoxicated. So you can see there's at least 3 different ways that we've just talked about here for how to operationalize intoxication. You as a researcher have to decide which one you think is best, and there's no one right answer to that. Any of those 3 or other ways to operationalize intoxication might work well for your particular study. There's no one right answer. You as the researcher have to think about it and decide which one you think is the best. So it's a judgment call. But the fact that it's a judgment call, by the way, is one of the reasons why assessing construct validity is so important. Because there's no one right answer, researchers are making judgment calls what they think is best. That means we have to make sure that we really are doing the best one, right? We have to make sure we really did choose the best way to measure that variable. So that's why we assess our construct validity. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, quick tip, I did post another YouTube video, not me, but somebody else talking about operationalization. That's in the same folder that this file is in. So you might think about watching that. It's just like 2 minutes or so and get a little extra info about that. All right, so let's talk now a little bit about what kinds of questions we could ask about construct validity. The truth is there are a lot of different things that you could ask to assess the construct validity of a measurement. So for example, you could ask about reliability, you could ask about operationalization, you could ask about those 5 subtypes of construct validity that we talked about a little bit before spring break. So if you were going to ask about reliability, you could ask about whether the measurement had good test-retest reliability or had good inter-rater reliability or internal reliability, depending on what type of measure it is. So for example, in the article that you guys read for last week's module, they were assessing the strange situation procedure, right? And they had, for each of the different things that they were assessing in that paper, they looked at the inter-rater reliability because they had multiple people coding things like the infant's reactions and what the physical proximity between mother and infant, right? So multiple people were measuring those. We had to look at inter-rater reliability, and in that article, we saw that all those measurements did have pretty good inter-rater reliability. So that's one question you can ask about construct validity. You can also ask about other validity-specific questions, not just reliability. So for example, was your measure associated with other things it should be associated with? Did it predict behaviors it should predict, right? Those 5 subtypes of construct validity. So for example, in the slides from last week, I showed you some screenshots of the SINS, that's the single item narcissism scale. And in that paper, they did 11 different studies testing a bunch of different questions about construct validity. So they looked, is it associated with other narcissism measures, right? They found that it is. That's an indicator that it has good construct validity. Does it predict behaviors that it should predict? Like I think one of their studies looked at, does the single item narcissism scale predict aggressive behavior the way that it should? And they found that yes, it does. So these are different ways that you can ask questions about construct validity. Now remember, construct validity is ultimately about whether you're measuring what you're trying to measure. So when you're asking about construct validity, you're asking questions about whether you really are measuring what you're trying to measure. And again, there's lots of different ways you could do that, like the questions on the screen here. You can also take a look at the activity key that's posted in the same folder this file is posted in. So you can see what things I wrote there as examples for questions you could ask in that activity. But just keep in mind, right, that's the kind of thing you're asking about with construct validity. You're asking about reliability, you're asking about those 5 subtypes of construct validity. And again, there's no one right answer or one right question that is to ask about this. There's a lot of different questions you could ask. The idea is just that those questions are getting at this idea of, are you measuring what you're trying to measure? Now, along those lines, I've reproduced that graphic from the textbook and that was in the slides from last week's module here. Keep in mind all of these items here, right? We have our 4 big validities at the top. Construct validity is just one of them. And construct validity encompasses all of the things that are in this graphic. So it has reliability on the right-hand side, right? It shows you about test, retest, internal, inter-rater. And then it has those 2 subjective ways, face and content validity, and 3 empirical ways, criterion, conversion, and discriminant. Now remember, for this class, I don't expect you to be able to tell those 5 subtypes apart. I think it's a little more advanced than this class, our 200 level class. So don't feel like you have to understand those 5 different types. Just keep in mind that they're all different ways that you could assess construct validity. So you could ask a face validity question. You could ask a criterion validity question. You could ask an internal reliability question, right? All of these things are questions that you can ask to assess construct validity. All right, now another common muddy point here is reliability versus validity. So people were specifically talking about in their muddiest points, how can a measure be reliable but not valid, and how do you distinguish those, asking for examples. So let's talk a little bit about that. We've talked about how reliability is necessary but not sufficient for validity. What that means is for a measure to be valid, to have construct validity, it has to be reliable. If a measure is not reliable, it cannot be valid by definition. But if a measure is reliable, that's good, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee validity, because reliability is really only about consistency, it's not about validity. So there's some examples that we could talk about to kind of show how this works. One that we've talked about before is this idea of head circumference as a measure of intelligence. I could take all of you, get a recorder here, like a measure, and measure the circumference of your head. And that would be a really reliable measurement. I could do test retest reliability. Every time I measure your head, it's going to have the same circumference, right? I could do inter-rater reliability of a kind, have multiple people try measuring your head circumference. They'd probably get the same answer. So it's a reliable measure. It's consistent. You're going to get the same answer every time. Does that make it a valid measure of intelligence? No, it's just measuring your head circumference. It's not measuring intelligence. If I was trying to use head circumference as an operationalization of intelligence, that would be a terrible idea. It might be a reliable measure, right? Because you get the same result every time you do it, but it's not measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. It's not measuring intelligence in this case. So that's a reliable measurement, but it's not valid. It's not accurately measuring what it's supposed to measure. So reliability is necessary but not sufficient for validity. Head circumference is reliable, but that doesn't make it valid. Another example is the idea of the miscalibrated scale as a measure of weight. If I get on the scale and it tells me I weigh 50 pounds, right, that's obviously wrong. Maybe the next time I get on it, it tells me I weigh 150 pounds and then 400 pounds, right? That's unreliable. It's not consistent, not giving me the same answer. If it's unreliable, it can't possibly be valid because it's going all over the place. It's giving me wildly different responses every time I use it as a measurement. So it has to be reliable in order to be valid, right? But it could be miscalibrated. Maybe my scale is off by 50 pounds, right? Every time I get on it, it gives me the wrong answer, but it consistently gives me the wrong answer. In that case, it's reliable, it's consistent, it's telling me the same thing every time, but it wouldn't be valid because it's off by 50 pounds. So that becomes an issue, right? So you have to have reliability in order to have validity. But reliability alone is not enough. A measurement could be reliable and be super unvalid, right? Like head circumference is a measure of intelligence. That's something you have to look out for when you're assessing construct validity. It's got to be reliable, but it also has to be valid for you to think that it has good construct validity. So hopefully that helps, right? It can be reliable, like head circumference, get the same answer every time, without being valid, if I'm trying to use head circumference to measure intelligence. All right, this is one of our last couple of muddy points here. This one is about how to assess reliability. What I want you to do for this is first off, go back and look at the slides, your notes, and the textbook from earlier in chapter 5. I know it's been several weeks since we talked about reliability in detail, but I think if you go back to your notes, the slides, the textbook, that'll help you kind of refresh yourself on those types of reliability. But here's a quick recap. Remember, we have three main types of reliability: internal, inter-rater, and oh my God, I'm forgetting the other one. Test, retest. Wow, my bad. Okay, those three types of reliability. Each of those can be assessed with correlations and or with scatter plots. And again, we talked about these before spring break, so go ahead and look back at all your materials to get a more in-depth refresher. But basically scatter plots, right? We're looking for dots that are closer to that straight line. That's going to indicate good reliability for us. Whereas if the dots are all over the place, that indicates poor reliability. And if you're doing it with correlations, then you want to look for values that are closer to +1. Remember, correlations only go from -1 to +1. 0 is no correlation at all. 1 is a perfect correlation. So values that are closer to +1 indicate good reliability. Again, in our article from last week's module, in all of their assessments of reliability, their correlation values were something like 0.86 and above. Some of them were in the 0.9 range. That's indicating pretty darn good reliability, as opposed to if we had reliability of, say, 0.4 or 0.2, that's getting closer to 0. That's telling us that it's not so good. We don't have very good agreement between our coders, for example, with inter-rater reliability, or agreement between different items in a scale, like internal reliability, or agreement between different times that you take the test and test-retest reliability. So closer to 0 indicates worse reliability. It's not consistent. But closer to 1 indicates good reliability. It is consistent. All right, now we already kind of talked about this earlier, but another common muddy point was how to decide whether something has good construct validity. What I really want you guys to keep in mind for this is that there is no concrete cutoff where you say, yes, now it has good construct validity. There's no magic number where you say, yep, all right, we're good. That doesn't exist. It's really a judgment call, and it's your job as the researcher. It's your responsibility to look at the weight of the evidence and make that judgment call. You can also make this judgment call as a reader of articles, like when you're reading the article on strange situation for last week's module. You can look at what's reported and say, I don't know if that was so good, or that looks pretty good. Right? But it's a judgment call. So for example, if you think about the slides from last week's module, the SINS paper, the single item narcissism scale, that has those 11 different studies testing different aspects of reliability and validity. The researchers, when they were trying to validate that scale, they didn't just do one quick check and say, all right, done, it's valid. They put a lot of time and effort into checking a lot of different things related to reliability and validity, so that they could feel like they have good weight of the evidence, a lot of evidence saying, yeah, it's a valid measurement of their conceptual variable, in this case, narcissism. Now, for you in this class, your job in this class is not to be a perfect judge of construct validity. With the activities from last week's module, is trying to help you get a little practice, because you get better at judging construct validity the more that you practice it. But the outcome for you in this class is not to be a perfect judge. It's just to get a little practice, a little utility in with trying to make those judgments, and to understand how you make those judgments, right? Like the previous muddy point talking about how to ask questions about construct validity. So really remember, it's a 204 class. You're in the foundation of the major. You're not going to leave this class being a perfect researcher, right? That's not how that works. But you're going to leave this class with some ideas of how the process of research works. And that includes this idea about how construct validity works and how you go about assessing it. Again, even if you're not perfect, you'll have some idea of how that works to help you as you go into methods 2 and the rest of the major. All right, last but not least, somebody specifically mentioned that it was hard to remember the stuff that we learned about validity before break and requested a recap video. I think that's a great idea, but it would be a pain in the butt for me to make an entire video about that. So I ended up finding a YouTube video where somebody else, probably using this the same textbook as us, has made a video that talks about some of these concepts. I think it's only about 4 minutes long, so if you have a couple minutes, you'd like a little recap, I recommend check out that video. The link is on this slide, but I also posted as a web link in our Blackboard folder. That's again in the same folder as you'll find this file. All right, that's our clear summaries points for week 1 module. I hope that was helpful for you. If there are things that you're still a little confused about, would like a little more explanation, feel free to email me. Remember, I'm on my email like all the time, Monday through Friday. So if you email me between 9 and 5, I will reply to you by 5. So if you'd like a little more explanation of something, then definitely drop me a line and we will chat.